You remember, even in 2020, which is long after the sort of anti-Huawei campaign had started, they still reported a revenue increase that year.
Yes.
Last year, these numbers show it was down about 30%. So it's a massive drop. 30% is bad, yeah? That's a big drop. And
yeah, well, I mean, under normal circumstances, if that happened to a regular company, it'd be like, what the fuck?
And nothing at all about profitability or what that means for cuts and, you know, staff numbers and everything. I mean, that'll probably come out, I guess, when they actually report all the gory details. But I think you can speculate from what they've already said over the first, 9 months of the year when they were revealing more detail and various commentary and stuff that we know and analyst companies, that most of the pain's been felt on the devices side.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast, the first one of 2022 and our first one for about a month. We weren't going to have quite such a big break. But we were going to do the last one of the year. I was going to bring in some bubbly. We were going to make a big deal out of it. And then I got the fucking Rona.
We did bring in bubbly, didn't we? Oh.
Yes. We brought in Dean.
So that's a terrible joke.
It's not quite the same. I mean, not that he isn't a complete treat as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was that. And, we had a sort of cursory chat about doing a remote one, but I wasn't feeling great. And, it just wouldn't have been the same. So we just thought, fuck it, let's just not bother.
Yeah.
So sorry about that. But, Omicron waits for no one. Incidentally, the symptoms weren't that bad. I just felt drained for 2 weeks primarily. Even for 10 days after, I'd have some days where I'd wake up thinking, all right, I've cleared it now. And then in the middle of the day, I'd just be poleaxed and have to have a siesta.
Yeah.
But, I think I got off pretty lightly. And you tested positive, didn't you, Ian, after that?
I had it.
And you didn't, your symptoms were almost negligible. Is that right?
I had a bad cough one day.
Yeah, I had it one day.
Yeah, and felt like a bit run down. And then my youngest son was feverish.
Right.
So I thought, up, because we were supposed to meet my parents. And if we hadn't been due to meet my folks, I probably wouldn't even bother doing a test.
Yeah.
I'd just have gone, it's something. But we were both positive. But then he was fine the next morning, and I literally was bad for 24 hours. And then I was testing positive for about 8 days afterwards.
Yeah, for 8 days?
Yeah.
That's really weird. Because that's one thing I was trying to get my head around is how... Because I figure the whole family had it. Certainly my daughter tested positive. I think my son might have had it first. I'm sure my wife had it, but we just never tested her.
Yeah.
And then when we have tested her subsequently, she's been negative. So when that window of when the little lateral flow that we can do at home, I didn't think it stretched as long as it was for you. So there we go.
Well, I think they said after 7, the rules at the moment, and they keep changing these daft rules, but after 7 days, if you've got a negative test, you can go out and about.
Yeah,
but if you're still positive, you have to wait till 10 days.
Well, the only reason
what if it's still positive after 10 days? And I looked at the government advice. It's like, don't worry about it. Just get on with things.
Just get on with it. The only reason I did it is because the day before, Pierre was about to go to Canada, and he was shitting himself about obviously failing a test and thus not being able to travel.
I was pretty convinced I was going to be positive.
Yeah. And he went, look, are any of you guys positive? And we went, no, we're fine. Don't worry about it. And then I suddenly thought, and I was feeling a little bit dodged, very early days.
Yeah.
I thought, shit, I can't do this to Pierre. I better have a look. And then lo and behold.
You did 3 tests.
I remember your picture of 3 tests.
Yeah. I know, I just thought I'd make sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the other reason I wanted to make sure is that we had something arranged for my daughter for her birthday that evening. We had to knock on the head, which was very upsetting for her.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make absolutely sure, but obviously I'm pleased I did. If I'd fucked up Pierre's Canada holiday, I would have felt pretty guilty. Pierre would have come at me with some kind of medieval French weapon.
The thing is, I had done my PCR test before we would have done the podcast, so it would have been on the way back, I guess. Or I would have landed in Canada.
Well,
and tested
you were there
positive
for a long time, though. So.
Yeah.
You'd have to stay in Canada. As one person I follow on Twitter is showing it's like -20 in Canada at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like -10 at one day.
Because it was in Vancouver.
Yeah, Vancouver.
Toronto's -18 at the moment.
Yeah.
But I was on the island and they had the worst snow since 1996. It was like 40 inches of snow.
Yeah, which is saying something for Canada, isn't it?
Yeah. It was fun, though.
My friend in Toronto said they don't allow indoor eating at the moment because of Omicron, but you can eat outdoors. And he sent a picture of the temperature. It was -19.
They made that joke in New York when they did that in New York, and there was like this guy on TikTok who was eating a pizza in the blizzard.
Yeah.
Like with the napkin, like his napkin blowing off.
I can remember in the first lockdown, me and my mate went to Chinatown because we quite often we go out on the Lash in Chinatown. We used to go to the Crowbar metal bar.
Yeah,
back when that still existed. And then we'd go and have a Chinese down on Gerrard Street, and we had to sit outside. And I just remember it getting real cold. We're just trying to shovel in this cold rice and thinking this is not quite the same. So anyway, we all got over it, and in principle, you and I are now immune.
Yeah. Well,
for a while.
For a few months, until the next variant comes along.
Yeah. I know. So that's that, really. Not that much else to report. It's all, the year's off to a bit of a crazy start. I mean, Bojo's getting hassled. That he seems to have been just constantly on the lash the whole time everyone else was locked down in 2020. It just seems to be this seamless fucking
rules don't apply to him, though.
For him. And the States politically is still crazy. Australia's completely lost its mind over COVID, hasn't it? We've had all the Djokovic stuff going on.
Still going on.
Yeah. It's just all. It's
still
just all
unresolved at the moment.
It's just all a bit mad.
I wonder if he plays. Like, is the other player going to be like, "Can we have new balls? Like, I don't want to touch his balls."
Touch his balls. That would be a good quote.
His question is whether he's had it, because the latest thing from Der Spiegel is they're saying his COVID test looks like it was falsified. They did they got a bit of an
and there was another bit
it.
Where he's been naughty, where he went and hung out with a journalist in Serbia, even though he'd been tested positive.
He went to like an event.
Yeah, if he tested positive.
Yeah, so
this is the thing.
I know.
Either way, it's bad, because he said, "Oh yeah, I've had it," and yes, I've been to an event, even though I was positive, so that's bad. Or he lied. And
I still think his original premise for coming into Australia without a vaccine on the grounds that he's had it, so he's immune, is sound.
Yeah. But the Australian government's come out of it worst of all.
Yeah,
I mean, and also what do they do? Because if they cancel his visa now, then there's several players who've been sent back on the same grounds. Yeah. So what happens to them?
That kind of absolutism, you're always going to tie yourself in knots, because there's always going to have to be exceptions.
They're starting to look like they've got a sort of vendetta against him. You know, it's all starting to look quite personal.
What if he was number 12 in the world? Would that be the same?
I think it's bureaucratic obstinance that they're worried about making a high-profile exemption.
Yeah.
Because then it's that incredibly reductive, infantile. Well, if I do it for you, I've got to do it for everyone type of thing. Not permitting any nuance, any wriggle room, any grey areas, which is typical of an obstinate bureaucracy. So, to be fair, England, and I say England rather than Britain, seems to have been all right.
We do.
The Celts have gone a bit Aussie.
Yeah.
But England, we just got maybe Bojo, knowing that this shit was coming, thought, well, I better.
Well, I think it's
slack.
and it's got to the point now where it's
You're
too
right. That's a good point.
I think it's got to the point now it's too late for restrictions as well. They wouldn't do anything now because you can already see the wave coming down on the cases.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't solve the problem.
I'm going to point to my last piece. So I felt like a real brave little trooper in the last week of the working year. I not only had booked off holiday, but I had the Rona, but I still worked because there was no one else around. I mean, Andrew was around, but he'd only just started, and I couldn't leave him all by himself, and our freelancers were already off. And the last piece I wrote on the Friday before I put my feet up and got ready to roast some turkey and pigs in blankets and shit, was just saying that I think there's grounds for optimism this year.
Yeah.
And this was looking, even back then, at Omicron as a probably mild variant that everyone will get and get natural immunity. And these curves that you were just describing, I think we'll get to a stage. I don't think I'll be able to say confidently that I was completely right till maybe the end of this month. But if at the end of this month the case rate's down in the UK, hospital rates, all that sort of thing, there's every reason to assume, as we seem to have been ahead of the curve globally, we seem to be quite soon after South Africa with this thing.
Yeah.
But that will set a precedent for the US and everyone else. Apparently the FTSE 100's at its highest since the start of the pandemic today. Okay. So that implies that the people who are a lot more expert and spend a lot more time obsessing about these things are feeling optimistic. And I'll stand by it. I think by the end of January, we're probably going to be going, okay, all right, the end's in sight, which leads quite neatly on. I mean, we've got three, in terms of sort of topics we're going to cover, which I'll come into a sec, we're going to try and do three topics that are sort of forward-looking. This isn't a predictions, it's not as formatted as that, but the topics that we're going to extrapolate into this year. But in fact, before I get onto the sort of pre-topic, I better do the thing I always forget, which is that if you're watching this on the site or on Facebook or on YouTube, you can also listen to it on Apple, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Yay! Oh, and also, I'm on dry January, so no beers, just a rock and roll Ribena for me today.
Crazy.
Yeah, we're not drinking either.
Yeah, I'm such a habitual drinker. It doesn't do me any harm to.
No, but if we're not all doing it, it's no problem.
Well, I don't want to do it if Scott's not drinking, and also it's a Wednesday, so it feels
It's a Wednesday, yeah.
It was a bit
yeah, so I don't know when you think you're going to turn this around, because one of the reasons the main reason we're doing this early is because Pierre's moving house on Friday.
Yeah, look, I'll turn it around so we can post it this week. Yeah.
Right, that's the plan, is it? Okay, all right. Yes, so yeah, the pre-topic is, I suppose, just following on from what I was just saying about Omicron and all that, is talking about trade events. So we've had the start of the year's CES. Ian, did you say you got a sense of how many people turned up at CES?
I think they've said about 44,000.
And what's normal for them?
Well, I mean, we were talking about it before we came on. Pierre said last year was about 170. I think it was 2020, 2 years ago. Yeah, it wasn't on last year. But they have been up at more than 200,000 in the past. So
if we say loosely a quarter of what the normal rate is. Yeah, and so
it's a big reduction, yeah. And also the other thing is CES. I don't know what the traffic's like in terms of how much of that's from the US and how much of it's international. I mean, if we're talking about the other big trade show that we all go to, MWC, that's very, very sort of international event, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we saw what happened last summer when it was mainly Spaniards. And not that many people, even when they were bribing the Spaniards to turn up. Yeah,
I mean, Spain's not a very big country compared with the US. So you can't really count on having a big domestic audience to come, really. Whereas you can in the US, you can get people coming across.
But they still only managed a quarter.
So I don't know what it means for MWC, but I touch wood that it doesn't get cancelled or anything like that, and we don't see big exhibitors starting to do what they've done for the last 2 years.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? We learned from 2020. We got a lot of mileage in terms of traffic for every time a vendor pulled out, we'd write a story on it.
Yeah, and everybody else was doing the same thing. I think all trade sites was
if they went ahead last year, surely they're going to go ahead this year.
Well, it went ahead last year, but it went ahead without people there, didn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, there were a lot of exhibitors that pulled out last year. Obviously, Ericsson's stand got taken over by our friend Daniel Royston, and was Nokia there last year? No, I don't think they were. I think most of the big exhibitors pulled out last year, didn't they? So the thing that went ahead in June was almost like not MWC. It was almost like a different show, really, I think, with a different audience, lots of cloud people, lots of Spanish students and startups. It'll
definitely happen, if only because I'm sure there are all sorts of financial reasons why the GSMA has to make it go ahead. Whether or not, I haven't got any new information on what relations are like between the GSMA and their major exhibitors. But, if you remember in 2020 when they had to call it off, there was a big crisis about, they got all that cash from everyone.
Yeah.
What are they doing with it? And they basically came up with the cunning plan of just saying, all right, if you come next year, you don't have to pay then, or some kind of deferred credit.
Yeah, which is already needs adjusting, I think, because they've sort of
and so there's that, and then there's this year, and so if they don't run it, then they've got to refund them. If they do run it, and Ericsson whatever decides to bail, then presumably they're in a stronger position of going, well, look, mate.
Yeah, they'll run it, and I mean, I'd be surprised to see it cancelled, and I'd be surprised to see lots of big exhibitors pulling out. I still think it's possible that a few decide not to go. But
Huawei was there this year.
They'll always be there.
I think it could go down to the wire a lot more. I think the Omicron situation is changing by the day.
Yeah.
I think by the end of January it could look really different. By mid-February it could look really different.
That would be good if that's the situation. But even if it's in the most optimistic scenario, I still don't see it being anywhere close to 100,000 people.
No, I'd say half seems fair.
Yeah,
something like that.
I think half would be.
Did we get any figures?
Well.
Footfall figures from last summer's one?
It was about 30, I think, in the end.
30, so that's a third, let's say.
I think it was about 30. I'd have to check that. But it was mainly from Spain as well. There were only 5,000 from outside
Spain. And there's no talk
Spain.
of them bribing sort of random Spaniards to turn up this time?
Well, no, and they probably won't want to. This is the thing. So of that 30, as I understand it, 25 were from Spain, and 5 were international.
Yeah.
And the numbers of international normal is something like 60, 70,000, yeah? So that's a massive drop in international traffic.
Yes.
Now,
so again,
that
a lot of it will
is-
depend on, as it always does. It will depend. If you hear some weird noise in the background, there's some, let's just say, renovation going on in the office. Yeah, so much of it depends on the Spanish government, as is always the case. If they suddenly go, you can only come if your name begins with Z and you're wearing purple and you hop all the time you're here, whatever arbitrary little rules they decide to put in. If they go all Australia on it, then no one's going to bother, myself included. I'm just not interested in putting up with that kind of bullshit. But if they're a bit more laissez-faire and they just go, yeah, all right, a bit of masking.
Yeah,
what are you looking at?
So Pierre just pulled up a story from Mobile World Live, which is the GSMA's own site, and they're saying 20k last year.
Oh.
Well, I thought the figures were 30. I'd have to check that because I'm
Yeah,
pretty
I
sure
thought-
I was told 30 by them.
Me too.
Yeah.
And that there were so I don't know where they've got
I
that.
seem to remember you having some
Unless
exchange.
they've revised it down afterwards somehow. I mean, I had an exchange with them and they were saying 30.
Yeah.
So
This is from 6th of
20's,
July.
20's 20's not good at well, that's after it. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
maybe they revised the numbers. No, 20's not good at all. So, yeah, I'd be surprised if they do more than 50. I really
Well,
want
I'll
much
tell you
more
what.
than 50.
So
but-
on the bright side, assuming it does happen, assuming the Spanish government aren't too dickish about things, a half-full Mobile Congress, assuming most of the exhibitors there, will be a more pleasant experience because those halls get a bit rammed. When it's a full fat MWC. So I think my prediction, in the name of prediction, then we better move on because you've got stuff to do as it's a Wednesday, and we don't have the prospect of sitting in a pub and talking shit for several hours
no, it's
afterwards.
unfortunate.
So you've decided to actually get on with your life this evening instead. I'm predicting it will happen. Let's say about maximum 50k turnout, but it will be symbolic as well of a return to normal. For the first time in 2 years or so.
Oh, sorry, in your article you actually say between 5 and 10,000. I don't know.
Oh, that was a speculative one.
Oh, speculative one. Okay,
based
okay.
on
Is that one of the ones you wrote that wound them up?
probably. No, I definitely did one where it was down as 30, about 30k. I think that was anyway.
Yeah.
I'll have to
Anyway.
drag it up.
So that's that. So onto our main segments. Hasn't exactly been a crazy start to the year for news, perhaps because of Omicron and all
Yeah.
that. By the way, I looked up Greek alphabet because we were going. When are we? What's the last letter of the Greek alphabet? Imagining that variant's going to come up before the end of the year.
Yeah.
And that's omega. And the etymology of the two of them is quite similar. They basically mean small o and big O, micron and mega. Micron and omega.
Yeah.
Isn't that
That's
cool?
interesting. Next one's pi.
Yeah, next one's pi. Yeah, that's not
which
so fun.
Sounds a bit boring, really.
I think when we get to omega,
The pi variant.
It won't be a variant of interest, I don't think. Pi.
No.
It just doesn't sound interesting.
yes, Corona pi. I think when we get to omega, we're not allowed any more variants. Someone's got a
That's it.
right to that bloke in Wuhan and just go, all right, fucking pack it in now, mate.
The pandemic is cancelled.
We've run out of Greek letters. Just that was great. Now can we just give it a rest? Okay, so we're going to. There was one little bit of news. The most read story for us so far of the year has been Rakuten, the Japanese sort of tech conglomerate, spinning off its thing called Symphony, which is basically its sort of outsourced sort of OpenRAN / RAN vendor operation.
Yeah.
And it's been doing this. It's been offering people like Telefonica and various people help with their OpenRAN stuff for a while. And so this seems to be sort of formalising the separation between the MNO Rakuten and the vendor Rakuten. So we're going to use that as a sort of platform to speculate about OpenRAN, which is bound to be one of the prevailing themes of the year again. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we're going to talk about roaming. It's just a fun story to start the year. 3 of the 4 UK mobile network operators, MNOs, said at various points last year they're going to introduce some flat roaming surcharge if you go to the EU after Brexit. Obviously, that led to all the usual Ramonas going, yeah, happy now? You got your different coloured passport and now you got to pay more. Are you happy now? You racist bastards.
Yeah.
And, my point, and I still haven't had anyone from any operators, and maybe you know something different here, is I haven't had any operator confirm to me that this has been compelled by a change in wholesale prices rather than just pure opportunistic profiteering.
Yeah.
Anyway,
No,
three
I
of
haven't either.
them said they were going to do it. One of them hadn't said they were going to do it, O2, and then now they've finally gone, right, well, there's an opportunity here, and they formally came out and said, we're definitely not going to do it, and presumably are basking in all the positive PR that comes from that.
Yeah.
So I think that's just a fun thing to recap on,
definitely.
even though I just covered most of it now. But we can speculate about roaming and where that's going to go. It gives me an opportunity to bait Ramonas again as well. And then I think we can talk about Huawei. They started the year doing one of their minimal, here are numbers. But even the small amount of data they gave us sort of didn't paint a great picture for them.
No.
And we can speculate about what they can do.
Worst year ever.
Yeah, what they can do to, if anything, to sort of change the momentum for themselves over the course of the year. So those are the three things we're going to do. I haven't got anything else. But yeah, you were talking about our numbers for last year. Are they for public consumption or not?
No, but we smashed last year.
Okay, so last year was our best ever year. We just put it that way.
Oh,
shall we?
always. Last year is always our best ever year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But significantly, yeah. So hurrah for us, and thank you, audience. Right. So OpenRAN. Yeah. So like I said, I didn't actually write this one, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. And I think Ian, you wrote some other stuff about racketing, so I'll just tee it up again. So OpenRAN more broadly, obviously we've banged on about it loads last year. The big deal being that currently, if you get a radio access network sort of base station type of setup, you typically go all in with one vendor, of which in most Western countries they only have two primary ones to choose from, Ericsson and Nokia, because we've outlawed Chinese ones, and the likes of Samsung are still sort of catching up. So the idea was to overcome this duopoly that we created through our own geopolitical fucking about. That's the technical term for it. We'll disaggregate all the bits and bobs that go inside this base station, the software, the baseband processors, the antennas, all this other stuff, and make it so that there is a market, there's competition within that. And you can sort of cherry pick. The analogy I always have is the difference between like building a PC from components yourself, where you get an NVIDIA graphics card and a gigabyte motherboard and an Intel processor and so on, and piece them all together, and there you go, as opposed to buying an Apple thing, which is just the complete, just turn it on and it works type of thing.
Yeah.
And Rakuten which is a Japanese, originally a sort of e-commerce sort of media player.
Yeah, it's a bit like Amazon,
yeah,
but much smaller, obviously.
Japanese Amazon, whatever Japanese for Amazon is. I'm not going to risk early cancellation by saying Amazon in a silly Japanese accent. Cause I think that's the sort of thing that get me in trouble. You can do French, that's all right. I can do Le Amazon, but I can't say in a Japanese accent because that would be racist, obviously.
Yeah.
Which I'm not. I hasten to add. So yes. So and they decided, fuck it, let's get into mobile as well. And they've chucked loads of money at it, and they're greenfield, which means that they don't have to worry about legacy kit. They can just start with the absolute best kit from scratch. And by virtue of doing that, they've sort of set the template, certainly for other greenfield operators, but also for everyone else. This is how you do it.
Yeah.
And so they thought, well, seeing as we've established this template, why don't we effectively license that to people by offering to help them out? A good example, I don't know to what extent they've interacted, but the best example of another greenfield operator to start after them has been Dish in the States. Yeah. I don't know, has there been much overlap between Rakuten and Dish in terms of exchange of best practice and that sort of thing?
Dish is a customer now.
Is a customer, right.
And they're using, they're not a customer in the way that so the two big greenfield players that have taken shape really since Rakuten are Dish and 1&1 in Germany.
The drill
and it's sort of taking what you were about to say anyway, because they've sort of
Yeah.
set up this. They
Yeah.
set up this bit
No,
they're
you go
trying to
ahead, go
license.
ahead.
Yeah, the bit they're trying to license, but they're basically trying to be a vendor.
Yeah.
As well as being an operator, and some of the technologies that they've rolled out themselves in-house or bought, as well as partner products, are things that they can sort of sell as a systems integrator to other companies. So I'm not sure their arrangement with Dish is only for a certain thing. I'm not even sure of the details, because Dish has sort of gone ahead and moved.
Done quite a lot of stuff by itself.
It's not by itself, but even some of the vendors that Dish had announced before. Before it kind of became a recognised Rakuten customer, or actually Rakuten, for instance, Altiostar is this US software vendor that does the software for the radio access network, and Rakuten used to have a stake in it, but last year they basically took over the whole company. They bought out all the other partners. So Altiostar is basically Rakuten, and they're being used by Dish, and that was announced before they did the kind of deal with Symphony, which is the name of the bit of Rakuten now.
The
Vendory bit, yeah. But 1&1's gone all in with Rakuten. I mean, they're basically, this is the old thing about Rakuten's plan to me. It's a sort of slight contradiction in a way, is that in the argument for OpenRAN and disaggregation and all this, is that you can have lots of different specialists lined up, and you go and you mix and match them. So you go and buy Altiostar, and then you go and get your radios from somewhere else, and you go and buy your OSS system somewhere else, and your baseband products, and you sort of stitch it all together, and lo and behold, you've got this, as you say, this sort of build your own PC type approach to a network. Whereas Rakuten just seems to be turning into a big vendor, really, or that seems to be its aim. This Rakuten communications platform and this list of different products that they offer now. I mean, the 1&1 deal with Rakuten is that Rakuten is building the network. So, they take charge of everything.
So how is 1&1 doing that deal with Rakuten different from 1&1 doing the deal with Ericsson?
And the arrangement might be a bit different in that other companies will be brought into the mix. So Rakuten, as a kind of systems integrator, will obviously be supplying Altiostar software and some of its other goodies, but then it will work with someone like NEC, for instance, on the radio units. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the one throat to choke thing, for 1&1 is going to be Rakuten. It's the same kind of relationship, and it's
and the
Rakuten
bloke can't go, that was Altiostar, and well, you're in charge of them. You're the SI.
Exactly. They're the SI, so they take responsibility. And obviously, a company like 1&1 has done this because this is a worry for operators. Is that if they start relying on systems integrators in this way, do the systems integrators just become the new form of lock-in? They've always been worried about this dependency on Ericsson and Nokia, and
that was always a thing way back, like decades ago, with SIs.
Yeah,
there was always the suspicion. In fact, I don't think it was even a suspicion. I think it was an open secret that some SIs would be in bed with some vendors.
Yeah. They have their own list of preferred partners, and of course they do. And so,
I seem to remember back when I did a different job, Accenture basically being called an Oracle reseller sort of thing. Yeah. Because whatever you asked Accenture to do turned out that Oracle was the answer.
Put it like this: I'd be very, very surprised if Parallel Wireless or Mavenir ever ends up showing up in a deal with Rakuten Symphony involved, because there's an immediate, they're obviously going to go ahead and say you should use Altiostar because it's in their interests too. And they're going to provide better pricing terms, aren't they, if you're using Altiostar, than as an incentive. They're going to provide better commercial arrangements. Why wouldn't they? They'd be stupid not to.
And also, contrary to the whole premise of OpenRAN, it might be better integrated.
Yeah.
Now
I have it. This is the interesting thing about how systems integrators work, because I talked with a guy called Steve Pappo, who's the CEO of Parallel Wireless. Parallel Wireless is another one of these software vendors, software specialist, competitor to Altiostar.
And they're positioning themselves as more of an independent disruptor.
They are independent. Now they were involved in liaisons with RFP type stuff to get a deal, where Tech Mahindra was the systems integrator for that project. And Tech Mahindra, according to Steve Pappa, I wrote this story a couple of years ago, so it's a little bit old now, but Steve Pappa said Tech Mahindra didn't want, he sort of urged the operator not to use Parallel Wireless and to use probably Altiostar, but to use
and they're probably getting kickbacks
because they had a stake in Altiostar at the time, Tech Mahindra.
Right. Well, it's just it's basically legal corruption.
The whole thing's just riddled with conflicts of interest, really.
One thing I want to say before I forget, as soon as you mentioned Mavenir, is next week we expect to have John Baker.
Yeah.
Who's, I don't know what his job title is, but he's a senior techie guy.
He is, and his own views on systems integrators are interesting as well, because he doesn't view them with a great deal of affection.
But he is, for want of a better term, an OpenRAN evangelist.
Yeah.
So I think we'll have a good chat, given that you and I, we have the reservations that you've just detailed now. So make sure you tune in for that one next week. We'll be actually back to Fridays. This is only Wednesday because of Pierre moving house. And so we'll be recording that on the 21st. We'll be publishing it on the 24th. And that'll be good. It'll probably be set up in a similar way to the Daniel Royston one, except instead of having a public cloud cheerleader, we'll have an OpenRAN cheerleader.
Yeah.
But yeah, it should be an interesting chat.
Yeah.
And he's coming over from the States. I presume he's got other things to do than just the podcast.
Yeah.
But
So I don't want to put words into his mouth before he comes over, but I suspect he would say it's more for the operators to kind of get involved and maybe try and avoid becoming reliant on systems integrators, which means them taking some of the burden on themselves. And that's very much what Vodafone's trying to do, for instance, with this whole, recruiting 7,000 software engineers over the next few years. Part of that is about not relying on systems integrators too much and having the sort of in-house capability to do it. But the trouble there is it's a huge operational challenge, isn't it? You're changing 7,000 software engineers, in a company that at the moment has about 9,000, I think, is really changing the look and feel of the workforce, the technology side of the workforce. They don't come from that background, that software background, operators, obviously. They've always been much more on the sort of hardware side of things. And it's just a difficult thing to do, I think. It's a difficult thing to retrain people. It's a difficult thing to hire good talent these days when there's so much competition for software people. And you've got to pay them quite a lot of money to get the good people. So I think it's a really difficult issue for operators, isn't it? Is whether do we use a systems integrator and we don't take on that challenge of trying to build up stuff ourselves, or do we try and avoid the worries about lock-in and becoming overly reliant on systems integrators and do what Vodafone's doing? Neither of them's an obvious solution.
Yeah, and there's the other thing. Do you remember last year we had at least one pod where we were talking about standards and specifications, and I always forget one of them. I think it's because they're both beginning with S. But a specification is a sort of looser agreed sort of technological roadmap, and a standard is a much more rubber stamped official thing. Is that right?
Yeah, standards bodies are
like 3GPP.
They're sort of recognised by the WTO, aren't they? And they have
and the whole way
they have to meet certain criteria.
And the whole way the phone industry works with generations of wireless is that the 3GPP manages the whole process, and everyone agrees, and it's quite bureaucratic and it can be quite long-winded. That's why we only get one every 10 years. But at least this is one where obviously I'll always have a dig at things like the EU, but one way big bureaucracies do work well is they have this super tanker inertia. If the EU decides this is going to be the new fucking way that all 27 members, or maybe it's 26 now, then that's just it.
Yeah.
And it's just a done deal. It takes a while to happen, but there's a certain permanence about it. And I'd say that's the thing about standards bodies, whereas we have sort of specification bodies. We have sort of ORAN Alliance and bits and bobs, but it still feels a bit fragmented. Like there was another story I wrote last week about how Fujitsu and NTT Docomo went over the I think the Japan Sea it's called, to help out KT, Korea Telecom. So I guess they sort of did a similar job to what Rakuten is doing for some people, except this was an alliance of a system integrator and an operator, but they were going over and delivering some best practice for OpenRAN to another operator. So that's happening there. Rakuten's doing its thing. Dish is doing its thing. Vodafone's very sort of pro stuff. It still feels pretty fragmented to me.
because it's a specifications group, and the whole point of a standards body really is that you only have one, and then it's a standard. The stuff that the ORAN Alliance is doing is not a part of the 3GPP standard, So a company can say
there's no 3GPP on ORAN at all, is there?
No, they're separate. They're separate groups. So this
but 3GPP doesn't have a position. It doesn't have any kind of
No,
process.
so a company Ericsson can say, well, we're going to use ORAN Alliance specifications in these products and make them available, but they're not baked into the 3G. But now I think what's probably going to happen is with 6G, and I spoke to someone who wanted to remain anonymous, but they kind of agreed that this was a likely scenario, is that those, if all goes well with ORAN and I mean, to be honest with you, all the concerns that I'm coming out with and that we've talked about for months and months on the pod about whether it is going to lead to competition, whether it is going to really sort of lower costs. I just think it's got so much momentum now because operators want it that it will. These
definitely be
these
thing.
Specs will be used by the vendors. Now, once the vendors have started using them in their products, they're the big players in the 3GPP, the vendors. I mean, this is one of the reasons I think why the ORAN Alliance was formed. It was concerned
the patents,
that
all that stuff.
The 3GPP become too sort of vendor dominated.
Right.
But once the vendors themselves have had to swing behind this stuff, and they've taken a big role, and they're both members now of the ORAN Alliance, Ericsson and Nokia, by the way. But the only really big vendor that isn't is Huawei. I think those specs then get taken back into the 3GPP at some point.
So over the course of this decade.
And then they become sort of baked into 6G from the outset. 6G becomes an open technology.
Which further confirms what you and I both suspected, and other people who've been on the pod, maybe Dean was one of them, have said this is a 6G thing.
Probably, yeah.
I mean, the good news is, because it started so early in the 6G cycle, it'll give us something to bang on about if we're still doing this, God help us, in 5 or 10 years' time.
Yeah.
It'll give us something to bang on about. Well, God, I'll be 60 then.
Yeah.
I'll be one of those 60-year-old journalists.
Drinking your Chardonnay and propping up the bar
and
somewhere.
Just talking about how young people have got no respect.
Yeah.
Actually, quite the contrary. What I tend to moan about is how young people don't go on the lash enough.
That's true.
You get these PRs who've got some budget going, come on, let's go out. And they're all like, oh, no, I don't think so. And it's just left for the sort of curmudgeonly old gits going, come on, keep it coming. Anyway, yes. So, to wrap that one up, because I'm having to keep each segment relatively short and sweet. I think it's interesting. The actual news hook was this Rakuten. What's the word you use?
Symphony.
Yeah, Symphony. Spinning it off. Yeah, sorry, that word was eluding me.
It's spun off, but it's still part of Rakuten Group. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, spinning off's always a bit weird. Just like OpenReach is spun off from BT. That doesn't really fucking matter.
It doesn't, but when operators talk about spinning off towers and infrastructure assets, they're often sort of interested in recapitalising them, aren't they? Or listing them or something separately and then getting other investors.
Well, I think maybe it's the financial thing. With Symphony being spun off from Rakuten, it has to be more viable financially by itself.
Yeah.
Or even if it's not, then the lines of it being cross-subsidised by the rest of the group will be more transparent, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, you'll be able to see its performance, how well it's doing. I mean, I just think organisationally it makes more sense from my perspective to have it's a vendor as opposed to the operator. It doesn't really make sense for them to be part of the same group and to have the same people. I mean, I think it raises questions about what some of the people within Rakuten are going to be doing. So, for instance, unless I've got this completely wrong, Tarek Amin's the CEO of Symphony, isn't he?
I forget.
I think Tarek Amin's the CEO of Rakuten Symphony, but he's also CTO of Rakuten Mobile, which is the operator. So is he? Do they try and appoint a different CTO now? Someone to come in and take up his job on the network side in Japan, and he can then focus on doing his Symphony role, or does he carry on doing the two? I mean, that's a question for them, I guess, but which I haven't asked, but. But it raises questions like that, really. But organisationally, I think it makes real sense to do it. I just don't know if it means they're looking to attract new investors or anything like that to Symphony, perhaps in the future, or
it enables. I think we agree. It's primarily enables sort of financial autonomy, and secondarily just clarifies the role in principle.
Yeah,
both for customers and for Rakuten itself. So that all makes sense, and maybe things like that Korea Telecom thing is an indication of why they've done it. Maybe Rakuten would have got that work, but Korea Telecom was like, well, how much are we giving away trade secrets to? Granted, not a competing vendor, but a neighbouring.
Yeah,
not a competing
operators
operator,
probably
but a
don't want to
neighbouring
buy
one.
from operators.
Well, certainly not that close. I mean, I can imagine Dish buying from Rakuten because they're the Pacific apart.
Yeah,
but when you're just one little stretch of Southeast Asia apart, I don't know.
Yeah,
yes. And I think, I think we agree that OpenRAN is going to continue to be a thing. There's certainly momentum behind it. It's not going anywhere. That's not something that we're going to contest with John Baker next week. What I imagine we will contest is why right now and for the next few years does it matter?
Yeah.
Why is it any better than just going with Ericsson?
I mean, my view is, and I wrote a piece on this, a sort of trends piece last week about how things will look in 2030, and the general sort of summary was that I think by 2030 we'll be looking at all networks being open in terms of using open specifications, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have a much more competitive market.
No, and it'll be like, so to go back to the PC analogy, it won't be like Apple, but it'll be like at work, we've all got Dell computers. We know that that's going to have an Intel chip. They've probably all got the same brand of motherboard. If they've got a graphics card, they've probably all got that as well. So we pretty much just buy a Dell computer. We don't think about the components. And so while we may, in 2030, have the choice of not getting an Ericsson or Nokia RAN, we'll end up getting a Rakuten or some other SI or, some specialist RAN vendor or RAN system integrator thing. And again, the degree to which an operator will cherry pick the components therein, I think will be limited. Because it will probably be obvious for each provider. Let's say it's a pure play SI, someone like Fujitsu or Tech Mahindra or Accenture or whatever.
Yep.
They'll do the thing that they've always done. They've gone, right, well, I think you should get this baseband, this software, this antenna, this bit, this, that and the other. And they'll go, yeah, well, if that's what works best, then fucking go for it. So the extent to which you're exercising choice over the components will still be quite small, I suspect.
Yeah. And I just think you end up with, I don't know if it really solves the problems that people want it to. I mean, they want to become less dependent on a few big players, don't they? But you just sort of, you're still only going to have a few companies that are capable of doing top-end semiconductors. You're still probably only going to have a few companies that are capable of doing top-end software. So you just get this, it becomes clearer where the value lies in each area, if you like, and which companies are doing different things. But you might still only have 3 or 4 players in each one of those different domains. You still have those dependencies in each domain.
And as we had chat when we had that BT lunch, which was very nice. God, that seems like ages ago. That was a good lunch. Turned into a proper sesh as well. The point I was labouring with, what's his name, McRae?
Neil McRae, yeah.
Neil McRae, was like the chip bottleneck, which is right now primarily Intel.
Yeah,
that's not much fucking choice, is it?
No.
Everything's Intel. I tell you what, just to round it off, because I'm going to move on. The funniest thing would be if in a decade's time, the 2 dominant SIs for OpenRAN were Ericsson and Nokia.
Yeah.
I mean, why can't they operate as SIs?
They are basically systems integrators now.
Anyway, yeah.
I mean, Nokia has. I think Ericsson takes more responsibility for silicon development than Nokia does. Nokia uses players like Marvell and Broadcom and Intel.
Yeah.
They work with other players. It's just you don't see that because they wrap it all up and put some of
they
their
call
own
it Reef
there.
Shark for some reason.
Call it Reef Shark, and then they sell it. But that's kind of the OpenRAN model we could end up having anyway. It's just a big player like Nokia,
with a badge,
and then all of a sudden
other
it's like,
people's stuff.
Well, why are there going to be 6 or 7 of those players when the market's consolidated down to 3 or 4 anyway, as it is?
The thing they'll have to be clever about is a lot of extra momentum behind this is coming from Yank politicians who don't really know what they're talking about and think of it as a way of sort of pluralising the market.
Yeah.
So they'd have to they probably have to resist rebadging stuff, because then that might get the politicians all like, oh, what's going on? So they'd have to be discreet about it, but there's no reason why they can't still take most of the business, which would make me laugh.
Yeah.
Okay, roaming. So yes, as I sort of trailed at the start, so we had, when was Brexit finally complete? Was it end of 2020? I don't know.
God.
Anyway, there were all those stages. There was all that agonising, wasn't there, and whether we were going to have soft or hard Brexit and all that crap.
It was end of 2019, wasn't it? No,
there was something about custom in January 2020.
It was.
I think so. Bojo won the election at the end of 2019, but then there was still a full year of David Frost arguing the toss with, what's his name, that French bloke. He now wants to be Prime Minister. Oh, shit, I've forgotten. Anyway, he was the main EU negotiator, some French bloke.
Right.
You know more than me.
Yeah. It's gone. All right. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah, and so, I obviously was a Leave voter, and I'm all for our sovereignty, our autonomy. We'll make lots of mistakes. We'll do a lot of things worse than Europe, but I'd still rather live and die by our own mistakes than be a vassal state. Is my position. And I firmly believe, and nothing that's happened since this pandemic started has led me to change my mind, that the EU primarily exists for the benefit of France and Germany, and everyone else just better shut up and fucking do what they're told.
Yeah.
But one thing I was worried about when it happened was roaming, because credit where it's due, it was the EU that made this roaming thing happen. They put the deal in. And do you remember it happened in sort of drips? There were sort of stages.
Yeah, it went on for years.
I still remember a time when I used to, not that long ago, when it was, had to do some serious calculations before you went on holiday.
Well, yeah. Well, it was first. It was voice was expensive, wasn't it?
And everyone would get bill shock and stuff.
You're still getting charged for data.
God, I can remember one Mobile World Congress I came back and there was some scary bills. And anyway, and so that was a worry because European operators are now not compelled to offer the effectively zero-rated wholesale roaming rates that they have to do to each other. They're not compelled to offer them to UK operators. So my assumption was that they'd just hike it up.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know what the economics are, whether or not they still make a decent amount of money, because you always got the impression that roaming was a bit of a piss take.
It's gone, so they don't make anything.
No, but yes, well, but they make the money from you using their network. I mean, we still have to, the EE that I'm on, if I go to France and roam, EE still has to pay SFR or whatever some money for that, don't they?
But those wholesale charges have been capped, haven't they, by regulation?
Yeah, so they're really small. But what I'm wondering is whether they're still better than nothing.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what disincentive there is for continental operators to hike up their wholesale charges. Whether there's competition there, whether or not they might think, well, let's just keep it as it is because it's all working.
The thing is, in a lot of cases, I think it's equivalence, isn't it? You have people in your country going out and using a foreign network, and at the same time, there are people from that country, home to the foreign network, coming to you and using yours. So it's, there are some countries like Austria, I think, where the operators make quite a lot of money out of roaming because it's popular for skiing at certain times of the year and they get a huge influx of traffic.
Yes.
And there are fewer sort of Austrians going around on holiday to other parts of the world. So there's a sort of net beneficiary, but I'm sure it works the other way around.
So there's that reciprocal thing, but that's a good point. But
I think there's an equivalent. It's a bit like the arguments about it's a peering type thing, isn't it? Internet peering and all this sort of stuff, which is one of the discussions that comes up when you talk about net neutrality. If there's an equivalence there, a rough equivalence, then no one really gains from it anyway.
So you're saying that maybe one of the major... I was looking for a disincentive for them to raise their wholesale prices, and you're saying a major disincentive may be that they don't then get retaliatory.
Well, if you're charging the same wholesale rates and you've got roughly the same amount of people going backwards and forwards between the two countries, then no one's really making any money, are they? It just cancels itself out.
I get your point. Yeah.
And the other thing I think is that a lot of these big networks that have rushed, the UK ones that have said, "Oh, we're going to reintroduce roaming." They have European networks themselves. They're part of European groups.
Yeah, Vodafone, for example.
Vodafone has networks all throughout Europe. It's got networks in Spain. It's got networks in Eastern Europe. It's, so. If you're a Vodafone customer and you go on holiday to Spain or Portugal, then there's they can arrange for you to be on that network. They can sort it out so that you would roam onto the Vodafone network. And then what's the point in charges? Passing backwards and forwards at the end of the day, it's all part of the same group. So
the underlying point, the reason I'm getting into the wholesale side of it, is that 3 UK MNOs announced last year that they were going to do, on average, I mean, there's some minor variation and depending on how far in advance you do it, but on the whole, £2 per day per person surcharge. So you go for your 2-week summer holiday, south of France, you're looking at £28 extra, which isn't scary, isn't the kind of bill shock you used to get, but it's still 28
quite a
quid.
lot though, isn't it? If you're spending 30 quid a month anyway, and all of a sudden you get one that's double.
Yeah, that's a lot of fucking. That's a lot of croissants.
Exactly. As my bill's pretty high this month. What's going on? If you take a couple of holidays a year, let's say, which people
and
do,
you take and you obviously you're a nuclear family, as we both are. Yeah. Then you're looking at 100 quid.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so you sort of think on one level you go, okay, well, I'm a Brexiteer, I can't really moan. It was always going to have some pain attached to it. But then I think, is this a consequence of Brexit, or is this just these companies taking the piss?
I think it's companies taking the piss.
Yeah, well, I haven't seen... Bit of both, yeah. Well, but it might not be. That's my point. If the wholesale rates haven't changed at all, then it's got fuck all to do with Brexit, other than it giving them a pretext to do it. And, I haven't been exhaustive. I haven't directly asked the question of any operators, but I'm not aware of any public communication from any operators saying wholesale rates have gone up.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote an article about this issue of companies having networks in other countries, yeah? And I think it was 3, because 3 has quite a lot of European networks as well, yeah?
Right.
And I think it was, I don't want to put words into their mouth if it wasn't them, but one of the operators anyway, it was either 3 or Vodafone, said it's just too complicated to do exceptions, if you like. Roaming charges won't apply if you're going to Sweden or Austria, where we've got a 3 network. Now that sounds like a rubbish excuse to me. Why is it too complicated? Why can't they say roaming applies but not in these markets because we've got our own network there? Yeah.
Well, quite. Well,
I just think the whole thing is just a really crap sort of opportunity to try and make a bit of money that they.
It seems that way to me, which leads me to the 2 stories that we've published this year that are worth sort of flagging up. The first one was Vodafone and EE, I think via the media rather than via a formal statement, saying we're going to delay it. So they were going to introduce their shit. 3 was going to introduce their stuff in March, I think.
Yeah.
But Vodafone and EE were going to do it at the start of the year. And then they just sort of went, nah, actually, we're going to put it off for a bit. We're still sorting a few things out. And the things they said that, it was all quite vague. I'm gonna find the story. What the fuck is going on with my stuff? Oh, that's because I got it on this. Okay, sorry. There was a sort of fairly generic statement from Vodafone and nothing formal from EE. Basically going, there's just a few teething problems. We just want to make sure everything's really smooth as anything before we start. We don't want to take any chances because we know this is a big deal. To me, I was just like, I'm not so sure. In fact, anyway, I've just found the story. I'll read out their statement. So this is just from a Vodafone emailed statement. We have pushed back the introduction of roaming charges to the end of January, giving time for further testing to ensure the best possible experience for customers purchasing our £1 day bundles. They've also got a £2 day bundle, and chances are you're going to have to buy that, but they're just trying to sneak a little bit of positive PR into their statement. Until then, customers will continue to be able to roam without charges.
Well, it's not going to be a positive experience for customers anyway. I mean,
the best possible experience. Well, the best possible experience is don't start ripping them off.
There won't be a positive experience, Vodafone, because people are going to have to pay extra.
Exactly.
So to get nothing extra, basically, to do what they've always been able to do.
In other words, to sugar the pill as much as possible.
I mean, I think there's a bit of panic because I think there was an expectation that everybody would follow suit.
Well, quite. So that leads me
in the way that cartels operate. Everybody sort of swings behind.
I use the word cartel as well. So let me butt in and talk about story number 2, which is headlined O2 exploits opportunity created by competitors' new roaming charges. And so last year, O2 was conspicuous by not having announced anything. I think at the start of the year, they found themselves in the middle of a tiny little media storm because they'd announced some kind of usage cap, and everyone's like, oh, fucking hell.
Yeah.
And the reason they got in trouble is because they were the very first to make any adjustment that appeared to be post-Brexit. And I think I led with a sort of Brexity angle on it, and the usual suspects got themselves all fucking bent out of shape about it, which, without realising, that's exactly what I wanted them to do. And so they've got this. We've got the excellently named Gareth Turpin. I mean, he sounds like a man from a different era, doesn't he?
Yep.
the Chief Commercial Officer for Mobile at Virgin Media O2 said, "We're starting the year by giving our customers some certainty. We will not be reintroducing roaming fees in Europe for customers on O2 or Virgin Mobile, unlike all the other major mobile networks who are bringing back roaming fees. We will not be following suit. Blah 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 blah. We think it's really important that everyone has a nice holiday," sort of thing. So he's really, he's really laying it on thick.
Yeah.
But I think nicely done. I think he should.
I mean, I think people probably expected Three to be the company that held out.
Well, that's a really good point.
They're always been the ones that haven't. This is the weird thing. They're the ones that are trying to be the challenger in the market, and they dropped roaming a long time before I think regulation.
Yeah, they made a big virtue of it.
So it's very odd that they've reintroduced it. I think, and it's a great opportunity for Virgin Media. I think for travellers for them to try and market their
totally. And I think you're right. I think the reason for this delay, is that they're shitting themselves because they knew perhaps they knew that O2 was going to make this statement. One thing, we give credit where it's due to Kester Mann from analyst firm CCS Insight regarding Three. He said this, which I copied and pasted into my story. He goes, "This move could hit Three hardest. It was the first to begin to phase out roaming in 2013 and has assertively promoted its Go Roam offer as it looked to differentiate by overcoming common customer pain points." Yeah. So that's it. So they've blown it unless they decide to change their mind. Hopefully, and I made the point in my final paragraph about cartels and how the fact that O2 is doing something different at least shows us that we're not dealing with a cartel, thank God. Just to remind anyone who's not familiar with the terminology, a cartel is when supposed competitors informally collaborate in order to fix prices. I'm hoping that the rest of them are going to bottle it.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that we start to see some indications, and we should probably keep a lookout. I don't tend to write much about changes in subscriber numbers just because I find quarterly so boring.
Yeah.
But it's probably worth keeping an eye on whether O2 does start to gain some customers at everyone else's expense.
Well, they'll probably gain me if the others do, because it depends how much travel returns. I mean, we do a lot of travel for work,
Yeah.
We talked about holidays. You go on holiday, you end up paying an extra 28.
What happens if we go to Mobile Congress and that costs us, 20 quid? Do we expense that?
Well, you would expense it, I guess. Yeah. But even so, it's a big outlay for someone who's paying it. It's the companies then. People who are on the road all the time. Imagine how much difference that's going to make, over 365 days a year. So you're travelling 200 days. You're talking about, another 400 quid.
And furthermore,
it's
£2 now.
Yeah.
We were talking before we started recording about precedents set during the coronavirus of restrictions of civil liberties and just crazy behaviour, and how we're worried that the precedent set, even if Omicron is the way out, and by the end of this year it's in the rearview mirror, that some of the habits we got into will stick.
Yeah.
I think, they set a precedent. People put up with £2 a day. They go, "Oh shit, it's we're going to have to hike it to £5 a day. Sorry."
Yeah.
Or we're going to have to meter it back to the bad old days. I can see all that happening. So yes, hopefully, O2 will scare everyone else into stop their profiteering. I take it all back. If wholesale rates have gone up and they're just passing those on, then I take it all back.
Yeah.
But no one's ever said that to me. Okay. Final one, Huawei. I'm going to mainly hand it over to you, Ian. You covered them. I covered it more briefly. You did it more comprehensively, as is often the case. They basically came out with their top line numbers for last year.
Yeah.
What picture?
Well, it was very
paint?
top line. It was they always do this thing where one of the perpetually rotating bosses has a sort of New Year statement.
He went, "Here's our numbers."
Yeah, and it's usually full of all these sort of proverbs and weird things about that they're taken from Confucius or some Western philosopher. And this one was a bit more.
It just happened Confucius said some really rude things about Americans.
This one was a little bit more sort of straight to the point, I think, and blunt. It was Guo Ping, I think, who did it.
Yeah,
and. But so the most interesting bit was there was all this stuff about mining and new opportunities and things that they're having to do because, the rest of their businesses, to diversify, because parts of their business are in deep trouble. But the first couple of paragraphs are the most interesting, where they sort of revealed their revenue numbers for last year. And you got to remember, even in 2020, which is long after the sort of anti-Huawei campaign had started, they still reported a revenue increase that year.
Yes.
Last year, these numbers show it was down about 30%. So it's a massive drop. 30% is bad, yeah? That's a big drop. And
yeah, well, I mean, under normal circumstances, if that happened to a regular company, it'd be like, what the fuck?
And nothing at all about profitability or what that means for cuts and, staff numbers and everything. I mean, that'll probably come out, I guess, when they actually report all the gory details. But I think you can speculate from what they've already said over the first, 9 months of the year when they were revealing more detail and various commentary and stuff that we know and analyst companies, that most of the pain's been felt on the devices side.
Yeah, the consumer division.
The consumer division, where they just can't get the components they need for top end smartphones because of US sanctions. They can't get software that they need because of US sanctions, and as a result, they've flogged a part of the handset division, which is Honor, which is apparently doing really well now.
Yeah, and we've said it loads of times before on the podcast. It's such a sort of obvious dodge.
Yeah,
if the US was trying to drive, if the stated reasons for the US victimizing Huawei, which is security and access to intellectual property theft and all that sort of thing, if those stated reasons exist, then how come Honor's fine?
Yeah,
I mean, it's even run by the guy who was running it for Huawei.
Now.
Well, partly.
Owned partly.
Yeah, and so we had these sort of various shady Shenzhen funds pitch in.
Yeah.
There was obviously a massive state whip round to make this thing happen.
So it really has got obvious connections to the government now.
Even more overt connections to the government than Huawei itself, and yet the Yanks are all right with that. I mean, it's completely incoherent.
Obviously, the sale of that's wiped out a huge amount of money that they used to make, and then basically what's happened is that Honor's become the business that does all the funky, sexy 5G smartphone stuff,
flagship stuff,
and the rest of Huawei is just doing fairly crappy products that you were able to get from other people years ago even, and its business is just handset business is just sort of in the doldrums.
Well, that's nearly all that 30%, because I think they said and the barely any information they gave, old Guoping sort of stopped dicking about in his chair for long enough to say this past year our carrier business remained stable, which implies flat
revenues,
and our enterprise business experienced solid growth. Now I know that's about a fifth of it.
It's pretty small enterprise, and they're not going to be able to replace handsets and networks with enterprise, clearly.
But my point is, if they're flat on operators, and if they got a little bit of growth of the smaller enterprise business, which constitutes a sixth or so of the business,
then obviously handsets.
Then the handsets have gone right down. That 30% will be as a result of 70% or so decline,
and that. And they were warning of that. They were saying that it was
because they were giving us quarterly updates over the course of the year.
I mean, the networks doesn't surprise me that much that it's flat, because despite all the pushback and the government bans in different markets, which hasn't happened on the handset side. I mean, the handset side has just been affected by sanctions. They can't get stuff. They need to make them.
They just can't make decent phones.
Which also affects the network side.
And let's not forget the Android thing as well.
Yeah. I mean, those component problems should affect ultimately the network side as well, but because the replacement cycles are much longer, and also they've carried on being able to. I mean, a Chinese consumer is not going to go and buy a Huawei phone nowadays. No. Even if he's trying to be patriotic, when you've got people like Xiaomi and Oppo
all the
and
Oppo
Vivo.
Group. I've got. By the way, we've got at home. I just sort of did a bit of buying for basically all my family except me. Their phones were on their last legs.
Yeah.
So I thought, fuck it, let's just get some. But you don't need to spend $1,000 on a phone.
No.
And you can get a really decent one for £200 or £300.
Yeah.
And it's basically the Oppo group, because Oppo also makes the OnePlus brand. So I think my daughter's got OnePlus, and my wife and my son have got Oppo. And they're all really decent. They're really happy with them.
Yeah.
And they cost like £250.
Yeah. So you've got brilliant alternatives that the Chinese consumers can buy, but the Chinese operators are going to carry on buying from Huawei and ZTE because that's all they've got, basically.
And that's Chinese the point. I mean, when they've got 2/3 of the Chinese domestic market, which is by far and away the biggest 5G market, then that will keep them going. But
their shares even gone up because, as we've talked about a lot before, Ericsson and Nokia have suffered in that market. They've had a backlash against them in the same way that Huawei's had a backlash against it in
and we
Europe.
saw how losing even like a 10% share of that market affected Ericsson's numbers.
Yeah.
So when you've got 2/3 of all that market, and it's more or less guaranteed, let's face it, unless they stop remembering how to make telecoms gear.
Yeah, and that's basically why their networks business is flat. So even though they're losing big deals in countries like the UK and they've losing work in Sweden and places, other markets. They can just count on the amount.
But they're
of work
regionally so much more exposed.
I
mean, there's going to come a time where China Telecom, China Mobile, etc., stop chucking so much cash around.
Yeah,
might not be for a few years yet.
I mean, my concern would be whether they can, these areas they're trying to push into, we're going to be a software company, we're going to do stuff for cars, we're going to be a cloud. I just don't see how they can really... Well, no government that's worried about Huawei's role in critical infrastructure is going to start buying... he's going to start buying cars or taking cars that are powered by Huawei software, are they?
Or having Huawei as an industrial SI.
Exactly, or allowing it to be used in mines or any of this other stuff they're talking about. So that's only ever going to be a Chinese and friendly African
uranium mine.
Thing. Yeah. So, and then they've also got problems there anyway because the cloud business they're trying to do. I mean, you need servers to run a cloud, to be a public cloud, which is what they've been talked about doing. We've got a big public cloud business now. Well, you need to have a server business to do that, and they can't get Intel x86 chips. They've had to sell off that business, as I understand it.
Right.
And they're now trying to shift towards ARM-based servers instead. But that accounts for a very small part of the overall market. It's only about 5%, I think, of the server market.
And even then, if you're going ARM-based, I mean, you've got Qualcomm, you've got MediaTek, which is a Taiwanese company.
They can make their own. They can make their own chips. They can design their own chips, but then you've still got issues with. I guess you've still got issues with the kind of manufacture of this stuff. They've just got big problems. I think trying to
bind, and I think that their attempt at diversification again feels like a geographical consolidation. They look like, from what they've revealed about their plans, in between all the Confucian sort of allegorical stuff, they basically they want to be this broad brush IT player.
Yeah,
but that's probably still mainly within China, and the Chinese state's probably reassured them that there's tons of business coming their way if they're half as good at doing IoT and industrial stuff as they are at networks, then no worries. But they're just incredibly reliant on China for all their revenue and the Chinese state.
They are, and I'm not sure that China the Chinese would want to be overly reliant on Huawei. They're going to have the same questions about. I mean, we've seen the backlash against Chinese tech entrepreneurs and Chinese companies within China. I don't think the idea of Huawei being this company that not only provides all the network equipment, but it's also the main cloud provider,
and it's the state telling you that you've got to buy Huawei.
Yeah, I just don't think that.
So that's one thing I think sometimes people forget about China. It's got this weird hybrid situation where it is still effectively a dictatorship. It's a one-party state. No one gets any say in who the main man is, and he's just voted himself president for life.
Yeah.
But, unlike, for example, communist USSR or other despotic states like North Korea or whatever, or Venezuela at the moment, or stuff like that, there is what appears to be a flourishing, for want of a better term, free market. There's lots of entrepreneurialism. There's lots of people making a ton of money.
Yep.
Places like Shanghai are as funky as any Western city.
Yeah.
And I think, and actually also lead to a good sort of wrap up, because we're running out of time and you've got shit to do. I think your point about the internal market not tolerating a single dominant IT player being imposed on them by the state is a very good one. And then more broadly, getting back to the theme that I spoke about, like with my last piece I wrote last year about their reasons for optimism for 2020. 2022, sorry. Is that, apart from the fact that I think the fucking Rona will finally run out of steam, lots of people worry about conflict between the US and China. But I think a really important thing to bear in mind, and then people talk about how the great experiment to welcome China into the global economic ecosystem has been a failure, the WTO, because everyone thinks they just took the piss by nicking everyone's intellectual property and currency manipulation and generally trying to rig the game in their favour. But, the two things I'd say about that. firstly, everyone else tries to rig the game in their favour anyway. So let's not over-demonise one country. And the second one is, I think we did succeed because we're now so economically interconnected that, let's say there was a hot war, and let's say China was the belligerent by invading Taiwan, the rest of the world would cut them off. They wouldn't be able to sell anything to anyone.
Yeah.
And then they'd be fucked.
Yeah.
Because I think it's one of the most export-heavy countries in the world. So that interdependence is what gives me grounds for optimism. There'll be continued saber rattling. They'll fly their jets over Taiwan every now and then. We'll all get anxious. But I just can't see how if we assume that they are a complete autocracy with Xi Jinping holding all the levers of power, I can't see how, and he's presumably a clever, strategic guy. I can't see how he wouldn't imagine that him being the belligerent in a war wouldn't ultimately be catastrophic for him and the Communist Party and for China, economically.
Yeah.
Even if they militarily prevailed in the war, though it's worth noting they still spend about a sixth. They've still got a fraction of the military budget that the Americans have. It's just the Americans like to pile in everywhere.
Yeah. Also, I was thinking, like, in a conflict, they have no practice. They don't really have practice.
No,
but the US really has practice.
Hong Kong.
Yeah, but not really.
Yeah, no, I was being facetious.
I was wondering because that would be an advantage.
You'd think, yeah. The
you have veterans have some practice. Who'd be like, yeah, I've done this all my life.
No, it's by no means a done deal. I mean, I don't see how anyone could militarily defend Taiwan because it's just right next door to this massive country. But I don't think that's the concern. I don't think that the military outcomes are the primary concern. It's the economic.
Yeah.
You know, even like World War II, they weren't talking about globalization in the 1930s. You know, things have changed so much in the intervening 90 years. So anyway, that's why I reckon that won't happen. So I'm saying everything will be mellow with China and coronavirus will go away.
Summer of love.
There we are. It's all going to be groovy, everyone. Yeah. So let's wrap it up there on that positive note. So don't forget, we've got a guest next week, John Baker from Mavenir. So until then, I hope you enjoyed this one and see you next one.